Welcome to the Arabesque Sewing Studio. I'm Ali Phillips, and in this video we're going to be making the Cottage Table Circle Coaster. So if you've just joined me after making the Cottage Table Square Coaster, well done. In this video we're going to continue the journey and learn some new techniques. So in this video we're going to be sewing a circle coaster, and I'm going to be showing you how to get a beautiful round curve that is smooth and even all the way around. I'm also going to be introducing some extra handmade embellishments that can hopefully spark your inspiration for how to add your own flair to projects. So we're going to be adding this little ribbon tag, and we're going to be adding a row of hand stitching, which really brings out these cottagecore vibes. Now, I truly believe that sewing makes the most sense when we can create something functional and useful, and the Cottage Table Coasters do exactly that. You can put a little touch of your own personality in every room of your home. And yes, this is a free pattern, so you can grab yours by following the link in the description below. Now, if you love educational sewing videos that help you grow in your skills and your confidence, I'd love you to give this video a like and hit that subscribe button. So if you're ready to sew along with me today, grab a copy of your pattern from the link in the description below and your supplies, and we'll get started. So let's run through the supplies and fabric that you're going to need to use today. So of course you're going to need a basic sewing machine. I also recommend that you have an iron and an ironing board or a pressing station. Now I'd like you to have 3 pairs of scissors here if possible today. So your first pair is going to be your large sharp shears for cutting fabric. Your second pair is going to be your small pointy scissors for trimming threads and for using at the sewing machine, and any little small delicate cuts that you need to make. And your last pair is going to be your paper scissors for cutting out your templates. So make sure you're not using your fabric scissors for cutting out your paper. You're going to need a pen for marking your fabric. You're going to need some fabric glue. So this can be a regular old school glue stick, or you can also use some PVA tacky craft glue. I've got this one in a fine line glue tip, so it dispenses with a syringe tip, and it's a very fine and accurate way of getting a perfect amount of glue. Now you're going to need some pins, you're going to need a ruler. I do recommend that you have your trusty seam ripper or quick unpick on hand, because mistakes will happen, and having this on hand will mean you can just fix them really quickly. Now, an extra thing today, we're going to have a little piece of ribbon for an embellishment, so we can make a little tag on our coaster. And I'm also going to add a row of hand stitching, and I'm going to do this with what's called perlate thread. So this is a heavyweight glossy thread that we use for decorative stitching and hand quilting. So this is a lovely raspberry colour today. That's going to match my ribbon tag very nicely. It's going to coordinate with my fabric. Now if you like, you can have a thimble just to help you push that needle through the layers. And of course, I've got a special needle for this hand quilting. So this is a large eye applique needle, and this is just going to mean that you can push this thick thread quite easily through the eye and get started with your hand stitching. So let's run through the fabric that I've got here today. So for my front, I'm going to be using this adorable floral with the lady's face on it. She's going to be the star of the show today. On the back, I'm going to have this lovely green gingham, and this is going to disguise the seam on the back very nicely. And inside it, we're going to have a layer of padding. That's going to be fusible fleece or batting, and I do prefer fusible fleece because it's very easy to work with, and then you don't have to worry about any of these layers coming off after you fuse them on. So make sure you've downloaded and printed out your free pattern, and please make sure to read right through your pattern before beginning so that you can clarify all the processes and understand all the steps before you get started. Now, just like before, you need to get to know the names of your pattern pieces. So this time we're going to be working with a front and 2 rectangular backs, as well as a piece of circular batting. Now, as you follow along down your pattern, you'll find that there's check boxes at every stage, and this is just a great way to keep track of where you're up to. Make sure that you're not missing anything. So go ahead and find your templates page and measure your scale square. So So double check that this is 1 inch by 1 inch, and then grab your paper scissors and go ahead and cut out both of these templates, making sure to cut with nice wide sweeping cuts, not shutting your scissors until you come to the end of the shape. Now before we trace our templates onto the fabric, it's very important to remember to press your fabric and get rid of all those creases, and this is just going to help you get a lot more of an accurate result as you trace your templates. So go ahead and lay your fabrics right side down, wrong side up. So this means that the pretty side is going to be facing down and the white or unprinted side is going to be facing you. Then grab your coaster, your front, and you're going to place that onto the fabric that you've got for your front. And we're going to trace around that by holding our hand firmly in the middle and going right around that edge. So I like to keep my fingers close to the edge if possible, and if I need to stop and adjust, I'll make sure that I'm keeping contact on that coaster paper all the time so that it's not moving. And then we're going to take the back template and we're going to trace 2 of these side by side. Now I do encourage you at every step to take your time and get things as accurate as you can, because every step is going to build on the one before, and the more accurate that you can be, the better that your project will turn out at the end. So now take your nice sharp fabric scissors and we're going to cut along the line that we've just traced with nice even strokes. You might need to cut a little bit slower just to get this circle nice and accurate. There we go. Then I'm going to cut these back pieces apart down the center. Now take your fusible fleece template and you're going to place this on top of the piece of fusible fleece with the glue side down. So the bumpy side is going to be facing down, and then we're going to trace around the batting template onto the fusible fleece. Now once again you're going to notice that your batting template is smaller than your front template, and this is to keep the bulk of the padding out of the seam allowance so that your coaster is going to have a much smoother, more round edge without extra bulk being in the way. So go ahead and cut this one out as well. So if you'd like to keep track of all your pieces, just pin the template onto the front of each piece. So this doesn't matter so much when you only have 3 pieces, but when you have a lot more pieces in a pattern and you've got many complex pieces that are all different shapes and sizes, keeping track of them like this is a really great way to stay organized. So now we're going to fuse the fusible fleece to the front of the coaster. So lay your front wrong side up and then take your piece of batting and we're going to place that onto the center of the circle with the glue side on the batting down, and we're going to center that as accurately as we can within the middle of that circle so that it's got an even border all the way around. Now I'm going to take one of the back pieces, so I'm going to fuse this fleece into place, and I'm going to use this back piece as my pressing cloth, because you remember you can't fuse the batting directly or it will melt. So it can still take plenty of heat, you just can't touch it directly with the iron. You're happy with that, and then just check that that's stuck nice and firmly, and if it has, I'm going to just move the piece of fabric over to the other side and press the second side. So then just double check a little bit on that edge. So now I've got the fleece fused to the front. So now we need to take one of our back pieces and lay it so that it's wrong side up. We're going to mark the turning opening on this long edge. So grab your ruler and find the center, roughly here, and then we're going to mark a 1.5 inch long opening on that side, and that's going to be the gap that we leave open for turning right side out. So then we're going to take the second piece and lay this so it's right side up, and we're going to take the piece that we've marked the opening on and lay this wrong side up on top of it so that we have right sides together. And we're going to align these raw edges and put some pins going perpendicular to this long edge. So keeping those layers together, I like to use about 4 pins down here. So now we're ready to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew down this long edge with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now there's a couple of ways that you can do this. You can grab your ruler and you can measure and mark that 1/4 inch line for you to stitch on if you would like to, or you can use the 1/4 inch mark that you might have on your stitching plate at your machine, or you can use a 1/4 inch foot to sew along. So I'm going to show you how to sew on the 1/4 inch line on your stitching plate today. So we're going to set the stitch length to 2.5 millimeters, and I'll see you at the sewing machine. So to identify the 1/4 inch mark on your sewing machine, let's have a quick look at your sewing machine's stitch plate. Now remember that the distance from the stitching line to the raw edge is called the seam allowance. Now you might find some little etched lines on your stitching plate, and some of them might have a marking on them as well. This is going to be the line that you align the edge of your fabric to get a different seam allowance. Now to find where the 1/4 inch mark is on your stitch plate, if it's not marked already, you're going to put your needle down and then take your ruler, and we're going to measure from the edge of that needle to 1/4 inch away, and you're going to see where that lines up. So for me, this is this first little mark here on the plate. Now if you would like to identify that a little bit more clearly, you can take some tape, and I'm going to line this up with that stitch mark, getting this nice and straight, and I'm going to extend this out down the front of where I'm sewing. And if you like, you can also put a piece of tape on the other side as well. So you can't put it right across the feed dogs here, because then it's going to get stuck as the fabric moves across as the machine sews. So you're going to just have to put it at the front or at the back. But then as you sew, you're going to line up the edge of your fabric with the edge of this tape, and that's going to greatly help you follow along and get a really straight stitching line. Now if you don't have any markings on your plate at all, you're going to follow this same method by measuring from the center of the needle 1/4 inch out, and then you're going to mark this with a piece of tape, and that's going to give you your guide to follow. Now as we sew this seam today, we're going to start at the top, we're going to sew a few stitches forward, and then we're going to back stitch, and then we're going to sew forward. As we come up to a pin, we're going to stop and pull the pin out so that we don't sew over the pin and accidentally hit that with our needle. Down to this first mark, I'm going to stop there and backstitch and cut the thread. Then we're going to start again at the other end of the mark. I'm going to sew forward and backstitch, forward, down to the bottom. And backstitch and cut the thread. So now we've got our seam sewn, and I've got my opening left in the middle there. While this is still flat, I'm going to take my iron and give this a press. Then I'm going to open out the top piece of fabric and I'm going to bring that across, and I'm going to give that seam a bit of a finger press with my fingernails, and I'm going to push that opening down and scrape that with my fingernail as well, and just get that to all sit nice and flat. And what this is going to be doing is pushing this seam in one direction so that both of those layers are going in the same direction. So then we're going to press that with the iron again and get that super flat. So now you can hardly see that that opening is there, but we know that it is. So we're going to be using that in a minute. So now I'm going to take my little piece of ribbon, and this is about 1.5 inches long, and I'm going to take my glue and I'm going to glue baste these ends together. So just put a little bit of glue there on the end and fold it in half. Make sure that those edges are aligning really well. So now I want to put this on the raw edges of my front here. Now I've got a little girl's face here and got some other floral pattern happening here. So I'm just going to have a look and see where I think a tag might look good on the side, and there isn't any right or wrong way of doing this. Just pick somewhere that you think is going to look good on your circle. I'm going to take these raw edges of the ribbon. I'm going to place this up against the raw edges of the circle, and then take a pin and pin that in place. So make sure that the raw edges are on the edge and the folded edge of the ribbon is pointing in towards the center. So now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to baste these edges to the circle. So basting is a temporary row of stitching or fastening to hold layers together. So this can be removed later on or left inside a project, but generally you can't see it. So when we baste, we're going to baste inside the seam allowance. So when we do this, I'm going to be basting at 1/8 of an inch, which is a half of what we are normally going to be stitching our seam allowance at. So that's about there where I'm marking that line. So we're going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to baste this ribbon to the front. So now we're going to take this back section that we joined together, we're going to lay this right side up with this seam vertically going down the center, and we're going to take the front of the circle and we're going to lay this wrong side up over the middle of this square. So one thing to bear in mind is we don't want to put this tag over this seam line. So just pay attention to where you're going to put this. Doesn't really matter where it goes as long as it's not on that seam, because that just makes it extra bulky. So before I pin the front onto the back, I'm going to mark my stitching line by placing my batting template back over the center, back over the top of that batting. And I'm just going to grab my pen and go around the edge of that batting again. Now if you like, you can just use the edge of the batting as your stitching line and keep your needle right up against the edge of that, but having a nice clear line to visualize where you need to stitch, to be able to follow that, can be really helpful. So I still mark my stitching line a lot of the time when I want something to be really accurate. So now that that's marked, I'm going to grab my pins and I'm going to pin the front to the back, pointing my pins towards the outside, making sure that everything's staying nice and flat as I go round, so nothing's wrinkled or getting distorted. Now if you've noticed that some of your layers are not sitting flat, just take the pins out again and play around with them until you're happy with how all those layers are sitting. You want everything to be as flat as possible. So now we're going to take this to the sewing machine and we're going to sew around the edge of the coaster at 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that means that our stitching line is 1/4 inch in from the edge of this circle. Now I'm going to be following the stitching line that I've marked here. And if you haven't marked yours, you can follow the edge of the batting. Now sewing a curve takes a little more practice to keep the seam allowance even and the layers nice and smooth. So take it slowly, stop when you need with your needle down, lift your presser foot to readjust the layers and the positioning of the project, and then just keep continuing, stopping as often as you need so that you can get a nice smooth curve. Now when we get back to the beginning, we're going to backstitch to secure the beginning. So now we've stitched this all the way around, we're going to trim down the seam allowance to about 1/8 inch away from the stitching line. So this means we're going to be trimming off about half of the seam allowance that we've got on the circle. Now I don't want you to trim across the ribbon. So as we come up to the ribbon, we're going to just taper out and just leave that the same length that it is now, coming up to the edge of that circle. Then just taper back down, back to 1/8 inch as you come away from that. So this is just going to give that ribbon the best chance of staying in that seam. If we trim this too close to the seam allowance, sometimes that can just pull out with a little bit of pressure. So we don't want that to happen. So with your nice big sharp scissors, just do nice slow cuts, cutting off about half of that circle seam allowance. As we come up to that tag, we're going to trim out to the edge of that circle and then taper that back down. Now trimming your seams around a circle is really important to getting a nice smooth curve on your circle. It really helps not having lumps and bumps. It just gets that curve nice and smooth. So now we're ready to turn this coaster right side out. So we want to flip this over to the back and open up this back opening that we left in the back seam. We're going to start pushing that front through the back opening. So pinch it and start pushing and pulling everything through. So just take your time because you don't want to rip the stitches around that back opening. Okay, so now we've got a nice rumpled mess. Doesn't look very inviting. So we're going to begin the beautiful shaping and moulding that we can do to make this back into a beautifully shaped circle. So reach your finger back inside and you're going to start pushing all those layers out and apart and run your fingernail along that seam and just start defining all of that. And on the front, you can roll those seams on the front and the back between your fingers and just get that edge of that circle right on the edge. So now we want to make sure all the raw edges on this opening are tucked neatly inside. So it shouldn't be too hard to get that to happen if you followed the instructions. And we're just going to glue base this opening closed. And this is all this is going to need to keep this nice and flat and shut. Even if someone comes along and tugs on this, that opening should stay nice and closed. So we're going to press that with the iron, get that glue to dry. And then we have a nice smooth opening here. You can see any kind of opening was ever there. So now we're going to turn our attention to the rest of this curve, and we're going to continue shaping and rolling this shape between our fingers. And what we're after here is to get that seam edge right on the edge so that we don't have any of the front poking around to the back or the back poking around to the front. So your fingernails are really great for this. Then I'm going to grab my iron and I'm going to use steam and a little bit of patience just to shape this to be as round as I can. So anywhere that I see a bit of a flat side that doesn't look quite right, I'm going to work at this. So while it's hot, it's very flexible. And you can use that heat to your advantage to get everything to go back where you want it and to keep the shape that you're trying to get it into. Now the very last step we're going to do for this project is to add a row of decorative hand stitching around the outside of the circle. So I'm going to use this lovely raspberry coloured perlite thick thread to stitch around here. I've also got a nice large eye needle, and I've got a thimble, which isn't essential but can help if you're having trouble pushing through the needle through the layers. Now if you haven't already done this, grab your stitching template and cut this out. And we're going to be tracing around this so that we have another line to stitch on. So once again, having a line to stitch on is just one of the best techniques to practicing being accurate and to make sure that you end up with all your stitches being nice and straight. This is particularly important when you are stitching a curve, because any little imperfections in that curve just stand out quite a bit. So you're going to want to do this as accurately as you can. You're going to center the circle template over your circle, trying to get an even border all the way around, and then take your fabric pen and we're going to trace around that. So now I'm going to cut a length of this thread about as long as my forearm. So just measure that, maybe slightly longer, and then take your needle. Now I find the best way to thread these large eye needles is to wet the end of the thread and then mash the end between your teeth so that you end up with a nice flat end that's going to fit through that eye. So if it's not fitting through, give it a bit more of a mash and a flatten with your teeth and give it plenty of moisture so that it's going to all stick together and fit through. Then we want to pull that tail through the needle by a few inches. Then we're going to tie a knot. So to do this, you're going to take the tail of the thread and you're going to place this behind the needle, and then you're going to wrap the thread clockwise around the shaft of the needle once, and you're going to pull it down and pinch it between your thumb and finger. And then you're going to pull up on the shaft of the needle while you're pinching that loop and pull all of that thread through, and what you'll be left with is a very nice little knot in the end of your thread. Now if you'd like a better demonstration of how to do that, I've got another video that shows that in a much more close-up fashion. So now we're going to bury the knot. So I'm going to come in on the back of the fabric and I'm going to bring my needle in and put it between the layers so that it's not sticking out on the front, but it's inside. And I'm going to bring that needle up somewhere on that line and start pulling that thread through. Now I don't want this knot to be seen, so I'm just going to trim that tail off a little bit closer to that knot. So what I'm going to do is give this a short, sharp tug to get that to go inside the layers. That's nicely buried there. So if you find you've got a little hole where that went in, just give that a little rub with your fingernail and that should disappear. So now we're ready to start stitching all the way around. So I'm going to put my thimble on and I'm going to take little stitches that go in and out. So pushing my needle all the way through and then back up to the top again and pulling all that thread through. And you can make your stitches as long or as short as you like, but typically about 1/4 of an inch for each of them, and about 1/4 of an inch apart is what you're going for here. So this is known as running stitch, and this is just where you're going to be putting the needle in and out of the layers and pulling that thread along. And what we're doing today as we're sewing this running stitch is we're quilting these layers together. So you are effectively hand quilting around the edge of your circular coaster with running stitch. So every now and again have a little look at the back of what you're doing and just check that you're happy with the size and shape of your stitches and of your gaps as well. Now getting this to be even and really pretty can take a little bit of practice. So don't be afraid if you want to just pull this out and start again. But also don't be too critical of what you're doing, because you are always going to be the biggest critic of your work. So just have fun with the process of what you're doing. Just put some nice music on and relax and enjoy the process of making something beautiful. Now you want to be pulling your stitches so that they're sitting snug against the fabric, but not so tight that they're going to be buckling the circle and making it all puckery. So make sure that they're not loose stitches, but they're also not too tight either. Just right. Now as we come up to where we started, you want to try and taper your stitches so that you're going to have an even stitching gap that can hopefully be hidden so that you won't be able to see where you started and stopped. So to finish off, we're going to take one more stitch, and you might need to fudge this a little bit because you might have a little bit of a gap that's not quite even. So what I'm going to do here is push my needle right through so that the stitching line is even on the front here, and then on the back I've got a little bit of a wider gap here, and so this is where I'm going to finish off my stitches. So I'm going to tie a knot that's not quite up against the edge of the fabric here. Put my finger on that, so that's a little bit loose. Then I'm going to push that needle down back in between the layers so it's not coming up on the front. Come up again a little bit further away. Then I'm going to give that a tug, and that knot has popped inside those layers, and I can just trim off that thread close to the fabric, and that tail is nicely buried inside of there. So now all that's left is to give your coaster one final press from the front and the back. So there we go, we have one very beautiful circular coaster that we can enjoy putting our drinks on. You can add this to your square coaster that you started in the first video and start to build your collection. Well done, you've just finished your very first cottage table circle coaster. If you've sewn along with me and made one today, you should be very proud of yourself. We've covered how to sew a curve and get it smooth and even, and how to add some beautiful handmade touches. Each one of these new techniques is building your confidence and your skills so that you can go forth and sew many more. Now we still have one more coaster to sew. Next up is the flower coaster, which is my favourite. It's a great way to add a little more playfulness and fun to your coasters. Now if you know someone who would love to start their sewing journey, I'd love you to share this video with them. Thank you for joining me in the Arabesque studio today, Happy sewing, and I'll see you in the next video.